A shifting landscape, internal strain in the Kremlin. The war that was supposed to solidify Putin's legacy as a strongman leader, restoring Russia to its historical grandeur, was swiftly spiraling into an unanticipated disaster. The initial rush to invade Ukraine in February 2022, filled with overconfidence and the belief that a quick victory would solidify his power, quickly turned into an ongoing nightmare of miscalculations. For Vladimir Putin, the realization that his gamble was failing came not just from the battlefield, but from the very walls of the Kremlin, where murmurs of discontent began to echo louder with each passing day. The failure to secure a quick victory revealed deep flaws within the Russian state apparatus, which had long been insulated by a thick layer of propaganda and tightly controlled information. What had been presented to the Russian people as a special military operation quickly turned into an all-out war, one that revealed the limits of Russia's military capability and the resilience of the Ukrainian people. At first, the Kremlin's carefully orchestrated propaganda machine sought to shield Putin from blame, but as Russian casualties mounted and the economic toll began to take hold, cracks began to form in the armor of control that Putin had so meticulously constructed. In a system where dissent is a dangerous game, the whispers of concern grew louder, not from the average Russian citizen who was bombarded with state-controlled media messages, but from the elite circles closest to Putin, those who helped maintain his grip on power. The elite's unease was palpable. The oligarchs, who had long benefited from Putin's rule and the wealth that Russia's state-controlled industries provided, began to fear that the war's failure would drag them down. High-ranking military officials who had supported Putin's invasion behind closed doors began to express frustration at the mounting casualties and the sheer scale of Russia's inability to seize Ukraine quickly. Some, already beset by logistical failures, miscommunications, and poorly executed strategies, began to distance themselves from the Kremlin's ever-increasing desperation. In Moscow's political elite, whispers of unilateral military blunders and ineffective leadership circulated, even if publicly the blame was shifted away from the top. But for those who knew how to read the tea leaves of Russian politics, it was evident that the days of unquestioned loyalty were numbered. Putin's hold on power was no longer as absolute as it once seemed. His military was faltering, and he was becoming a figure not of strength, but of fragility. The military failure, a broken narrative of strength. Putin's narrative, carefully cultivated over years of absolute control, relied heavily on the image of Russia as an indomitable military force, one capable of asserting itself on the world stage. From the outset, Russia's military invasion of Ukraine was supposed to be an embodiment of this narrative. Russia would roll over its smaller neighbor with overwhelming force, reinstating its authority in Eastern Europe and quelling any hope of Western-backed democracies along its borders. Instead, Putin's forces met unexpected resistance from the very people he underestimated. Ukraine's military, bolstered by a sense of patriotic duty and bolstered by Western military support, took the fight to Russian forces in ways that Putin had not prepared for. Initially, Russia's military advances were swift, but they were poorly coordinated, and they lacked the adaptability needed to outmaneuver Ukrainian forces. Putin's assumption that Ukraine's military would collapse was swiftly shattered by a combination of factors: the Ukrainian will to fight, intelligence sharing from NATO, and the use of high-tech Western arms like Javelin anti-tank missiles and HIMARS rocket systems that decimated Russian armored divisions. The battle for Kyiv, which many analysts believed would be over within days, became a symbol of Russian miscalculation. By April 2022, Russia had withdrawn from the outskirts of Kyiv, unable to take the capital or even secure its hold on surrounding regions. This was an unprecedented setback, one that shattered Russia's confidence and deeply humiliated its leadership. The psychological toll of the military's failures would be felt throughout the entire war effort. Morale plummeted within the Russian military, with increasing numbers of soldiers either refusing to fight or defecting. Reports emerged of poor logistical planning, a lack of critical supplies, and the deterioration of chain of command structures, leading to disastrous consequences for Russian forces. The growing number of casualties, both military and civilian, would eventually force the Russian government to admit, albeit indirectly, that the war was not going according to plan. Putin's misjudgment in underestimating the strength of Ukrainian resolve and the international backlash was compounded by internal dissent, as Russian officials and military commanders began to quietly voice concerns about the direction of the war. What had been sold to the Russian people as a mission of liberation and reunification was quickly becoming a humiliating struggle for survival. A withering economy, the cost of isolation. While Putin grappled with his military failures, the economic fallout from the war began to hit Russia with full force. The West's response to Russia's aggression was swift and severe, and the sanctions imposed on Russia by the United States, the European Union, and their allies became a decisive blow to the Russian economy. These sanctions were designed not just to punish Russia, but to isolate it from the global financial system, aiming to cripple Putin's ability to fund his war efforts and maintain his grip on power. By the summer of 2022, Russia's economy had begun to unravel. The ruble, which had once been a symbol of stability, began to plummet in value. Inflation soared, hitting ordinary Russian citizens hard, with prices for basic goods skyrocketing. The sanctions had a profound impact on Russia's energy sector, cutting off access to critical technologies and foreign investment. Despite the Kremlin's attempts to pivot toward China and other non-Western nations, these efforts could not replace the scale of the global economic isolation that Russia now faced. Oil and gas, which had been the backbone of the Russian economy, became the target of Western sanctions, and the global energy markets were irrevocably altered. Once a major supplier to Europe, Russia saw its market share diminish as countries scrambled to reduce their dependence on Russian fossil fuels. Germany, for example, made major strides to reduce its reliance on Russian gas, accelerating its transition to alternative sources of energy. In Russia, the effect was devastating. The country's once booming energy sector began to falter, unable to pivot fast enough to alternative markets in Asia. Moreover, the growing military expenditures required to sustain the war effort against a well-equipped and motivated Ukraine only deepened Russia's financial woes. Without the necessary resources to sustain its war machine, Putin's regime faced an increasingly unsustainable situation. By 2023, the Russian government found itself trapped in a financial vice, unable to extract sufficient resources from its diminishing pool of international trade, while also being forced to continue its costly military campaign. The growing global isolation, Putin's vision collapsing. Beyond the economic impacts, Putin's global standing began to crumble. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which had been framed as a defensive move to protect Russian interests in the region, quickly became a pariah act in the eyes of much of the world. Initially, Putin's close allies, including China and India, refrained from condemning the invasion outright, but their cautious support did little to offset the overwhelming pressure from the West. While Russia sought to build a new bloc of allies to counterbalance the West, these attempts were hampered by the growing awareness of Russia's weakening economic and military power. Countries that once hesitated to challenge Russia began to shift their allegiances. In Eastern Europe, nations such as Poland, the Baltics, and even Finland and Sweden took decisive steps to strengthen ties with NATO, spurred on by the realization that the West could not afford to allow Russia to rewrite the borders of Europe. Ukraine's appeal for support was met with a wave of diplomatic gestures, as nations rushed to arm Ukraine and increase sanctions on Russia. The West, once divided over the issue of NATO expansion and Ukraine's future, found a renewed sense of unity in response to Russia's actions. This growing isolation was compounded by the erosion of Russia's international influence. Putin's vision of a multipolar world, in which Russia would play the role of a counterweight to Western powers, began to fade as China's cautious stance, coupled with Russia's diminishing global standing, revealed the cracks in this vision. Putin's decision to invade Ukraine, in seeking to rewrite the global order, had instead set in motion the very forces that would isolate Russia from the international community. Conclusion: a regime at the edge. Putin's path has led him to the brink. The war in Ukraine, which began as a bold assertion of power, has now become the epicenter of political, economic, and military turmoil that threatens to unravel his regime. The combination of internal dissent, military failure, economic collapse, and global isolation has exposed Putin's vulnerabilities in ways few could have predicted. For the first time in years, the Russian leader's grip on power is being tested, and as the war drags on, it seems ever more likely that the consequences of his miscalculations will haunt him long after the final shots are fired. For Russia and for the world, the next chapter of this conflict will not just determine Ukraine's future, it will be a pivotal moment in the evolution of global power. As Putin's vision falters, the world must now consider what comes next in a world that will never be the same. This section further expands on the political, military, and economic consequences that have unraveled Putin's regime. If you'd like, I can continue expanding sections or move toward the next part of the script. Let me know how you'd like to proceed.